Welcome to class. Today's topic is black bears. Specifically, we're looking at one of the temperate species to know species, and a species that I think everyone's familiar with, and I think you all have some interest in. So we're going to do a close-up on black bears today, Ursus americanus. And forward to the next slide. As you remember from the mammalian species assignment, that if you're looking for some basic information on a mammal species, this journal publication is a good place to go to for scientific peer-reviewed information on a species. And so we'll be using that to discuss a little bit of the natural history as one of our sources. Black bears are part of a family of bears that are found across the world. You'll notice some interesting things as you look at the distribution of bears. They are quite prevalent across the northern hemisphere, for example, but looking in the southern hemisphere, you just notice in South America, they have a fairly limited distribution, and it's hard to see here in Africa, but there are no bears at all in Africa. And I always find that pretty interesting, considering the great mammalian diversity of hoofed animals, in particular in Africa, that they would have so much diversity of one kind of mammal, but no diversity of bears in Africa. In North America, we have black bears and brown bears. They are different species, but they are not identified by their actual color. So those are a little bit confusing or misleading names. Really, they're identified by other morphological features. And if you look at a black bear, it is you're able to identify a black bear by things like not having a shoulder hump and having that straight face profile, in contrast to the brown bears that definitely have that shoulder hump and more of a dished face profile. You can also tell the difference in their prints. There are 16 subspecies of black bears. We won't go into any detail on those, but do be aware that many species that have large distributions may also have quite a few different subspecies. Looking at bears, there's some interesting things to notice here about their relationships with each other. Notice, for example, the brown bear is more closely related to the polar bear than the brown bear is related to the American black bear. Also, over time, you may have heard things like, are pandas really a bear? They are in family Ursidae, so they are a bear. But some other species here, like the raccoon and the lesser panda, are actually not in family Ursidae. They're separate in this raccoon family. And try to fast forward the slide here. Oh, goodness. It's stuck. There we go. So hit pause after I ask this question. See how far you can identify black bears, starting with domain. You for sure should be able to get down to subphylum. Think to yourself, what class do they belong to? And if you can, fill in order, family, genus, and species. You've already seen genus and species earlier in this presentation. So hit pause and then hit play when you're ready. Okay, so down here, I will start with class Mammalia. They are, bears are in order Carnivora. We haven't talked about that group yet, but we'll get back to that later this semester. They're in family Ursidae. You saw that on an earlier slide. And they're Ursus americanus. As usual, you don't need to know any of these numbers. I'm just trying to give you a sense of what black bears are. As I mentioned previously, their color of their coats can be quite variable. Coats can be cinnamon brown, actually ranging to white in color. The color of the coats is not what identifies them. And just to give you an idea of sizes, the masses of bears, males are, of course, larger than females. And throughout their range, there may be different average sizes, say in New York, than they are down in Louisiana. Some other things to notice on this slide include the plantigrade configuration of the foot. We haven't talked about that yet in class, but we'll come back to that later. So right now, just hear that word, but you don't need to know it yet. And another thing to point out is that bears do have a baculum. It's actually a penis bone. We haven't talked about that yet in class because we haven't gotten to class Mammalia. So hold on to that thought, but bears do also have a baculum or penis bone. Bears can be described as solitary, meaning they are not herd animals. They're not moving around in a group, except for mother and young. And they can also be described oftentimes as crepuscular, that's being active at dawn and dusk. Bears can also be nocturnal. Now, without the human influence, they can also be diurnal, but most of the time bears are trying to avoid the presence of humans, and we're pretty much everywhere. So that's why we tend to not see them so much at day. And bears have definitely responded to the presence of humans. This is a historic distribution map on the left. You can see at one point bears probably covered much of North America. Today, their range is greatly contracted, and certainly they're missing from large swaths of where they used to occupy. So this is a distribution map, right? It shows where they are across their entire range, but it can also be helpful to zoom in on various parts of ranges. And so looking here just at the New Jersey black bear distribution, notice that even within New Jersey, their locations are spotty and they change over time. So blue denotes 1995, the green is 2000, and the yellow is 2009. So look at how the changes have occurred in their distribution, even across a pretty short period of time. And if we want to look at individual bears, that it can also be helpful to think about things like home ranges. So a home range, if you recollect, is that area where an animal does its daily activities, right? And so within the distribution of black bears, there's going to be multiple individuals occupying home ranges. And the home ranges of males will actually expand across or extend across several home ranges of females. And thus the male home range size is often much larger than it is for female. So there may be other female home ranges embedded within that male home range. Again, the idea here is to understand a bit more about the history, the natural history of black bears, but also to continue to think about how do we describe natural history in terms of distribution on large spatial scales, distribution on smaller scales, and how does that contrast or compare with home ranges. Just another map of home ranges. I'm thinking about this concept of home ranges versus territories. We've talked about that already, so just a refresher. If we were in class, I would ask you what the difference is. Hit the button and pause for a minute if you want to try and recollect on your own. Okay, so you're just hitting play again on your video. You should have said a territory is an area that's protected, while home range is an area that's not necessarily protected. And so a territory and home range can be the same size, or a home range might be just one part of a territory. And males are extremely territorial in some parts of their range, so much so that they will really be aggressive towards younger males within their range, and sometimes enact quite a bit of physical damage to a young male, as seen in this picture. This picture was taken by a Paul Smith student during a summer that he worked in an area where this male was commonly seen, and he took multiple pictures of this bear, and then by the end of the summer, this actually was healed up pretty well, which also just brings me to the idea that a lot of times animals are well suited to heal quickly, and from what would appear to us as pretty irrecoverable injuries. But given enough time, they can often survive and continue to go about their daily business and live for many more years. Some folks say that bears mark their territories with these claw marks on trees, and maybe you've seen these, particularly on, for example, beech trees. The marks show really well on beech trees. However, if you think about it, black bears, look at their faces, think what their faces look like. They have fairly small eyes. And so that tells us perhaps that eyes aren't terribly important to bears, and they probably don't look across a swath of land and say, oh, look, that tree's scratched over there. That indicates there's a territorial male here. The marking of the trees may not at all be related to marking territories. And we may also think, okay, bears have a pretty good sense of smell, and so perhaps they use some olfactory smells or signs to indicate territories. So just want to point that out to you that we probably don't think that these scratch marks are indicative of marking territories. It's not a visual signal to other male bears. When you look at a black bear, or any bear actually, you can often say something generally about its age, as in it's a young animal or it's an older animal, by its overall head structure. So look here, this bear has a very pointy triangle, indicating it's a younger bear, and this bear has a broader head, and so the triangle is not quite as pointy. So that could give us age classes in general. If we want to know more specifically, within a year or so, you can actually remove one of the premolars. And we haven't talked about different teeth yet because we haven't gotten into class Mammalia yet. So recollect the teeth in the front of your mouth are your incisors, and those pointy ones, the Dracula ones, are canines. After that are your premolars and then your molars. The premolars on bears are pretty small and not very consequential for them. So it's actually quite fine to extract a premolar from a bear that's anesthetized. And then that tooth can be cut in cross section, and the rings can be counted, and that can tell us how old a bear is. So getting more into a class like wildlife techniques there. So if you want to know more about aging animals, it's something that's covered in wildlife techniques. Bears don't have any main predators here anymore, but people and the effects of people are definitely one of the major causes of mortality. So in the upper picture, we see bears that were harvested, and certainly that is one cause of mortality for bears. The bear in the bottom right was hit by a car. Certainly as young individuals disperse and move off to find their own new home ranges or territories, they're more likely to be hit by cars. And so that is a source of mortality. And that is a bear in the left-hand picture, looking kind of werewolf-like, I suppose. But this bear has a very bad case of mange, and so has lost a lot of fur. And disease can be another cause of mortality for bears. Bears need a variety of habitat, just like so many different species. They need different habitat, perhaps for reproduction than they do for winter survival. So one of the main aspects of habitat, of course, are dens. Dens serve as a birthing location for bears. Dens may occur in old trees. They could be high up in the tree where a hole is, or sometimes the hole is actually high up in the tree, but the entire tree trunk is hollow, and so the bear will go in the tree and then travel the whole way down to the base and actually be closer to ground level. So quite a bit of variation just in den trees. But bears don't need to just have a tree. Sometimes they may be under a root mass where a tree has fallen over and there's just a root mass available that makes an indentation in the ground. Or other man-made structures, such as under a front deck or a back deck or porch. And so bears are really just looking for a place to get out of the elements and be undisturbed. Young males will often, it's not even really a den, but they'll, during the winter, kind of curl up on the landscape somewhere, maybe underneath a tree that's fallen over, so they're barely under the tree trunk. It's not a lot of protection, but they may move several times during the winter. So you may actually flush a bear from its den during the winter if it's a young animal, and moving on from there. So moving into reproduction on bears, bears are polygynous. We've used that word to describe one male that mates with many females. As we saw with the home range slide, one male's home range may overlap several home ranges of females. And so that male is mating with all the females with which his home range overlaps. And the life cycle for reproduction looks something like this, starting with the number 1 up here, which says year 1, winter. The cubs are born in the den. They are going to spend the rest of the winter with mom there in the den, emerge from the den, go out and spend the summer eating all kinds of good food, and then that winter, den up with mom again. So that first winter, they're back in the den. They go off again with mom during the summer, and at this point, they become separated from mom. Mom is going to be increasingly less tolerant of them, chasing them off. And then this year, mom's going to go den by herself without these cubs, and these cubs are going to go off. And they're subadults at this point and den on their own. There's actually a lot more to the story, so hang on to that idea. I'm going to tell you what else is happening there in just a moment. Bears have something called embryonic diapause. It's also known as delayed implantation. Excuse me. And then the concept is something like this. The bears mate. The fertilized egg does not implant in the side of the uterus, in the uterine wall, but instead waits to implant. After some period of a couple months, the fertilized egg implants and then development starts. There's no development that occurs until the implantation occurs. Once it implants and develops, the mom gives birth. And then, of course, she's in the den with the babies and she's nursing the babies, right? So the question to all of you, and if I was in class, I'd say, let's stop and think about this as a group. Why would bears have embryonic diapause? Why would they not have implantation immediately, move along with the fertilized egg developing and give birth earlier? Feel free to hit pause, think about that for a minute. Okay, hopefully you hit pause and try to figure that out. What's the point to this? So if you think about it, if the female was bred in fall, and then she did not have delayed implantation, and instead the egg implanted and began developing right away, and she gave birth sooner, that means she's giving birth sooner in the winter. So now she's some young ones that she needs to nurse for longer while they're denned up, while she does not have access to food. And so she needs to produce milk for them, and it's using energy from her body, but without a chance to replenish any of that energy. Not just is she nursing them earlier in the dens and nursing them for longer, but they're going to grow to be larger while still in the dens. And so they're going to be ever more demanding in terms of their nutrition requirements. So it's going to put an increasing pressure on her body to nurse those young. Okay, so why doesn't she do this then? Why doesn't she just mate later, not have delayed implantation, and go through the whole reproductive cycle immediately instead of waiting, and then give birth right before, spring, when she can walk out of the den with the cubs, maybe shortly after, and find food, not necessarily with the cubs, but walk out of the den, find food, and have enough food to produce milk in order to nurse her young. Well, that's not going to work out exactly either, because she's not going to be able to mate in the middle of winter, right? She's denned up. The males are denned up. They're denned up because there's not enough food on the landscape. And so it's really not an option to wait to mate. And it's really not an option to give birth earlier. So really delayed implantation is the best of both worlds. She and the male mates when there's plenty of food. They're both walking around the landscape, walking around within their home ranges. There's more of a chance of finding a partner to mate with, more of a chance of the female getting pregnant. And at the same time, she's not running the risk of needing to nurse them when there's not enough food available for her to nurse them. So hopefully you can see, hopefully I explained that okay, that made sense. If not, let's talk about it on Wednesday when I'm back in class. Okay, as far as diet of black bears, it's pretty varied. They eat a little bit of everything. They eat insects and grubs, and they eat hard mass on the landscape like acorns. They eat soft mass like berries. They eat grasses, especially some of the first grasses that come up, some of the first vegetation that comes up in early spring. I do have a fawn hidden there in the lower left-hand picture. They are going to potentially in spring, when they emerge from the dens and they're hungry and their bodies are needing to replenish protein in particular, they would certainly predate on a young fawn at that time. And I have a picture of a cacti there in the middle, cactus, because it depends where they live. Whatever's available, they're going to eat a whole lot of whatever happens to be on the landscape. I have a picture or a video here I'll just play real quickly. It's not a very long one. But in this video, we see the bear overturning logs and getting at ants or whatever their invertebrates are in there. They have excellent claws designed for that to rip the log apart. And they're snuffling, I think much like a dog does, just snuffling up any of the ants and other invertebrates that are in that log. It reminds me so much of my dogs when I watch a bear eat like that. Well, go ahead and let that video play out all the way just because it's fun to watch. All right, so as this video finishes up, we'll go on to the next slide. So food is also pretty seasonal for bears. So even though they'll eat pretty much anything, it's really dependent on what's available. So the upper left picture is indicating some of that first vegetation that comes up. So items like skunk cabbage in early spring. As you move into summer, this middle picture here, a lot more berries become available. They're likely to switch over to a berry diet. And then as fall approaches and the hard mass becomes available, they're switching to hard mass, and hard mass is great because it's allowing them to eat a lot of calories and put on a lot of fat before they den up for the winter. So when we think about bear habitat, there has to be food available, but it also has to be habitat that's going to provide food across all 3 seasons, spring, summer, and fall. I always think of bears as being very opportunistic when it comes to food. I don't know the history on these pictures. These were sent to me some time ago, but what I like is it shows the dexterity and persistence and abilities of bears to get to food. In this case, of course, it's a bird feeder. And it also brings up the idea that bears will eat at bird feeders. And so if you're having problems with bears at your bird feeders or other animals, simply take the bird feeders down, let the bears move on to other food sources. That's really your best course of action. All right, so continuing to think about habitat, bears live in that broad distribution that we saw across North America, lots of different kinds of habitats. The picture on the left there's from Big Bend National Park in Texas. So very dry, arid environment, quite different than the bear habitat that we have up here in the Adirondacks. And as we've mentioned already, that foods are going to change seasonally. So in fall, foods are looking for that hard mass in order to fatten up, to den up for the year, while spring and summer foods are different. And again, those are going to be variable depending on where they're living on the landscape. So it might be, alligator eggs if they're down in Louisiana, but certainly that's not what they're eating seasonally up here in the Adirondacks. Their habitat must also include corridors, a way to connect between different kinds of habitat. Bears have very large ranges compared to a lot of other mammals. We've already talked about the idea they need to get to different kinds of food in different seasons. We've also talked about the idea that males have very large home ranges overlapping several females' home ranges. And so for all of these reasons, bears need to move among different patches of their habitat. And so we're at the point now, because we've dissected so much of the landscape, that we often need to provide artificial corridors for bears. So the picture on the left shows some corridor habitat passing over major highways. And the picture on the right shows a place for bears to actually pass under or under roads, for example. And so this has now become part of how we think about habitat for bears as managers. Bears also need escape cover from whatever they feel is a threat. In this case, oftentimes it is humans. It might be hikers. It could be hunters. But there needs to be thick habitat. The photo here on the left is of laurel. So this is a kind of vegetation found predominantly in the southeast United States, and it's really, really thick. And bears need to have that habitat that they can retreat into or escape. And of course, we've talked about dens, excuse me, and the variety of habitat they can provide for dens, either trees, rocks, rock crevices, underneath where trees have fallen, quite a variety, but really not, if you're thinking about a cartoon like the bear in that big, huge den that's the size of your living room, that's not what is denning habitat. It's often just a small little crevice that basically, I've been in a few bear dens, like I often barely fit in a bear den. Like I crawl in and I'm curled up and that's like all the space that it has. So it doesn't have to be large, but it has to be available. And that brings us to the end of the quick close-up on bears. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm at this conference and it's getting loud behind me, so I hope you're not hearing distracting noises of people yelling. Anyways, thanks so much for tuning in today. I'll be back on Wednesday. We'll see you then.